Hello, class. Hello, class. Welcome to week 4. We're off and running, getting down to the home stretch. 2/3 of the class is done. I don't know how you feel about that, but this week we're going to talk more about the intelligence community. We've talked about the INTs, and we've talked about collection and analysis, and we've talked a little bit about policy, and we've talked about law enforcement down at the lower echelons. So we're going to look a little bit more at why we have intelligence. If you're a police officer and you're working for the FBI, et cetera, and so your goal is law enforcement, then you have intelligence, obviously, to support the end state mission of law enforcement, basically. And so their type of intelligence is going to be just about everything that we've already talked about, HUMINT, et cetera, even down to GEOINT to a certain extent now, where we're seeing the small handheld UAVs slowly make their way into law enforcement. So they have those same types of things. Their analysis is going to be kind of the same way, et cetera. They're governed by different sets of laws. No, I shouldn't say, strike that. That's not what I meant. The law which tells them how they can gather information and share it and use it in a court of law is slightly different in terms of warrants, but the federal government has tried to emulate that too, as we see with the catastrophe that ended up with the FISA warrants during the early years after 9/11, where the National Security Agency was collecting domestically, which is not allowed. It's not allowed in the intelligence community, okay? If you have like a warrant and you have that type of stuff, then you could do it, but you are not supposed to collect against U.S. citizens in the United States. So even when I worked at the National Security Agency, if somebody high level was traveling, a named person, so we say like the president, or the Secretary of State or whatever, we would have to get a notification from the State Department that would allow us to use their name in our SIGINT reporting, even though it's common knowledge that the Secretary of State is X, Y, or Z. We still had to have that authorization to be able to do that. We wouldn't be collecting on them. We would be collecting on, say, foreign entities, but those foreign entities might be talking about them if they've had like a meeting, et cetera, and so therefore we need to include that in the report. But there's special processes that have to be, you have to abide by in order to get that done, if that makes sense. So when we look at federal intelligence, it serves many purposes, but when we go up that pyramid, like outside the Department of Defense and Department of State, et cetera, at the end of the day, the main reason that we have national intelligence and the intelligence community is to support national security policy and the formation of our strategies and policies when it comes to how the United States is and what we do in the world, how we fit into the international structure, et cetera. So when we look at the national security establishment, you're going to read about this week with Mr. Lowenthal again. You will see that there are 5 aspects, main components to the national security process and policy makers, and that is, of course, is the president as an individual, just himself, and then all of the subordinate departments that we see, the State Department, the DoD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is where I worked when I was at the Pentagon. Certain issues that you may have depending on what it is, what the national security issue is, you may see other entities involved in there too, like Agriculture, Treasury, et cetera, DHS, Department of Homeland Security. The third one then is the National Security Council, which is the hub of the system. So the National Security Council sits in the middle of that process, and everything else is all around it, to include the intelligence community, which is the 4th component. So this structure, this policy, these concerns, they define requirements, and from those requirements, that's what's going to feed out and drive those collection processes, et cetera. And then, of course, the guys who hold the money is the U.S. Congress. So the Congress controls all of the expenditures, and so those are the 5 aspects of that. And then you'll have the committees, et cetera, that come out, and we have oversight and accountability to make sure that we're not, spending money stupidly, et cetera. But when we look at the intelligence community across the board, again, they're supposed to work together, but they're going to tie to different things. They're going to tie more to whose requirement is what. I don't think that makes sense. Let me rephrase that. GEOINT is a really good example because it's so technically, there's so much technology associated with it. So if we look at GEOINT and we look at like satellite imagery, the Department of Defense may use some of that, but generally speaking, satellite gathered imagery by via GEOINT and the NGIA, that's going to support something else. DoD has its GEOINT assets if you look at like UAVs, but if you know at the now historical picture forever and ever of President Obama and Hillary Clinton watching the death of Osama bin Laden on a UAV feed, that obviously was either a CIA or DoD bird. I mean, I don't know. I guess I could go look and find out who it is, but I'm not even sure that's been disclosed. But that was UAV footage that was over there, and probably what the guys on the ground were wearing in terms of their own like Borg-like cameras, etc. So different components. So who's feeding what, and so when we look at those loci inside the policy structure and policy makers, it's not one size fits all, right? Some policies are going to be for this group, and some policies are going to be national security policy is one size fits all. But how that drives down then the requirements and the operations of the separate entities, that's when it becomes a little bit different, okay? So Trevorton, you're also going to have some reading this week about Trevorton, and it goes back to week 1 when I talked about stovepipes, and I talked about like the formation of the agencies, and even when we look at law enforcement, I mentioned it last week, where you can have these stovepipes of like this is federal and this is state, etc. And so Trevorton's going to talk to you a little bit about breaking down the stovepipes in collection and analysis, and that is important because, again, technology is going to facilitate some of that sharing of information and breaking down those stovepipes. But when it comes down to, everybody wants to keep their job, everybody wants to look like the hero, everybody wants to secure their funding, things like that, then the stovepipe thing, there's a personal piece of it too. So we'll look at that a little bit too. And then I'm going to ask you this week, now that you've done a lot more reading, I want you to go back and take a look at competitive analysis again and tell me what you think about it. Tell me if your initial impression of what it was and whether it was a good or bad thing still holds true now that we're 2/3 of the way through the course. And so that's kind of what we've got going on. You have your large country study due this week, and it is and go to the syllabus to find out what countries you can choose from, and then there's a set of questions that I'm asking you. Those questions are like my intelligence requirements, okay? Those are my requirements that I'm defining for you for your paper. And so what I would like you to do is take those questions, and you're going to put them basically into a paper, though I don't want you to answer them as if it's like an exam, okay? So you're going to take those, the requirements are going to guide your intelligence gathering, basically, and then you're going to bring all that back to me and draft it into a larger assessment, and we're going to go from there, okay? Should be interesting. This is actually a fun assignment. I think people enjoy this one a lot, is my opinion. And that is that for this week. Okay, so this week's a little drier because it's more like politics and architecture. I'm not going to lie to you, but I need to make sure that you understand how those components kind of work together. And when we look at like the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that you understand how those things all work together with the National Security Council to guide, as it works its way down the pecking order, how those operations occur. And so then who is responsible for what? And who has the authority, and who has the responsibility, who has the oversight, who's accountable, etc. So, and then after this, next week, we'll talk a little bit about covert. Dun, 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 covert operations. And that's that, okay? So have a good week, and I'll see you in Blackboard. And I hope you're enjoying the class, and I look forward to reading your papers. Ciao.